You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome to episode 15 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
Good, thanks, Brendan. How are you?
Good. Thanks for being here. So today we have a very special episode for everyone. We're going to be focusing on one of the most important topics in Flesh and Blood, deck building. So deck building in Flesh and Blood is both complicated and unique. With your deck's resource base directly attached to every playable card in your deck, the choice of what's good and what's not good can be a little bit complicated. Don't worry though, because Arsenal Pass has got your back with this episode of Deck Building 101. Anyway, as always, Hayden, let's talk about your week in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, 100%. So, been able to play a little bit of Flesh and Blood this week, which has been good. Played an Armory last night. Played a bit of Prism, actually. So, have been playing some Prism recently, which has been different. I think it's not a playstyle I necessarily enjoyed right off the bat, but the more I've played it, I've kind of grown to love it a bit more, especially when I get to sort of, play the Aura's plan, or I really like Iris as a weapon. So, that's been pretty nice. Also played a bit of Blitz with Gauntlet on Tuesday, and just a bit of testing. How about yourself?
Yeah. So I played some Blitz in the form of Ira again, so I've kind of been turning off my brain playing a little bit of Ira in these Blitz armories. Unfortunately, a lot of the European ones that I was playing during the week are getting canceled now in lieu of in-person events, which is, I guess it's bittersweet in that sense. But I did play a gauntlet that was class constructed on Saturday. It was interesting. We had another victory by Katsu Control, so it was an exact copy of Winton's deck from the PTI, and I was actually playing Katsu mid-range aggro, and yeah, I missed out on top 8 on breakers, but it was all good because I actually had to drop anyway. For some reason, I thought the event was on Sunday, but it's on Saturday, which is pretty classic. But yeah, really interesting to see. It was a very big event. I think it had close to 60 people. And yeah, I think the top 4 was, Shane didn't really make it at all. So not what everybody was expecting. And we see Katsu Control taking another big victory.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to see what happens as the format unfolds. Obviously, Road to Nationals starting next weekend. So that'll probably give us a flavour of, I think, we're probably going to have a handful of Road to Nationals in the first weekend alone. I think we'll definitely see some top 8 decks and what's winning straight away. So, could it be a continued reign of Katsu Control? To see.
Yeah, it's crazy that you say Road to Nationals next weekend because I hadn't even mentally registered that was a thing.
So soon.
Oh, yeah, here comes all the traveling. So, oof. But anyway, take us into the news, Hayden.
Yep. Not a huge amount to cover this week. Nothing really crazy happening. No big news or announcements over the week. As we said, Road to Nationals does kick off next weekend. Not sure exactly how many are on the first weekend, but I know there is a reasonable amount in each region. So we're definitely going to see across Europe, across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and possibly parts of Asia as well. Some Road to Nationals. I'm sure we'll get some deck lists from there. We'll get some idea of what heroes are shaping up in this early beta to be at the top. Is it what we've thought and seen so far with Katsu and Chain? We're going to see Bravo. We're going to see Dorinthia. Yeah, really interested to see what happens in the first week. The other thing I wanted to shout out was the LSS Devastation is ongoing. So we've had that series, I think now 4 or 5 matchups come out now. Quite a lot involving Chain because Jason Chung has been sort of winning every game so far in the Devastation series. So I think we've seen Chain versus Azalea, Chain versus Bolton, Chain versus Kano, the Sarai versus the Dash deck. So a lot of Runeblade action. Might see Levy next from Jason. Have to see.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride on the Devastation series. I think the last video was funny because I think they accidentally uploaded the incorrect video first and then uploaded the correct one after. But yeah, we did see Chain versus Bolton. Looks like Bolton bricked a little bit on that one, but go check it out yourself if you want to see it played back. Speaking of YouTube, I do want to shout out the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. Hayden and I have been uploading a lot of content over there recently. We've been focusing a lot more on growing our YouTube, so uploading deck text, gameplay, and most recently we had a class constructed game of Prism versus Bravo. Really interesting game, very, very close. Encourage everyone to check it out if you're interested in class constructed and specifically interested in Prism or Bravo. With that being said, we did kind of reach our goal of 500 subscribers. Hayden is a blonde man now. I'm sure the next time we see him on camera, he will look very handsome with his new hairstyle. But we have also gotten up to, I think, 600, creeping up on 700 now. So really awesome support on YouTube. If you guys are interested in deck building, deck text, gameplay, all that good stuff, go check out the Arsenal Pass YouTube and throw us a subscription. If you enjoy the content, it helps us out a ton. And now my favorite part of the episode or of the podcast. We have to think up some witty quip in 2 seconds where we throw on our thongs, put on our board shorts, throw on the suntan lotion, head over to the Command and Cookout. What is it this week, Hayden?
I just wanted to.
By the way, thongs are flip flops in Australian. We're not wearing attractive swimwear here.
I don't call them that either. I'm from New Zealand. It's literally only Australia, I think. So we'll just leave them off on that one. Do you call it suntan lotion?
Yeah, we do. Is that weird?
It's suntan. I would think that would be like an oil you put on to help you tan.
Well, what do you call it?
Sunscreen. Blocks you from the sun.
Yeah, we call it that too. Maybe I'm weird. I don't
know. Anyway, all right. Let's jump to the Command and Cookout. So we got a question this week from someone who is a good friend of mine. David Marshall sent us on a question. Dave is a player out in New Zealand who is recently actually top 16 the Calling in Auckland, New Zealand, and unfortunately just missing out on a win and very close to that top 8 in that event. So congrats to Dave there. But Dave sent us a question and said, how important is mastering a class versus diversifying your skill set? Dave says, you guys have spoken before about playing one class to understand it thoroughly in all matchups, but is it equally important to play other heroes to understand their weak points and play patterns?
Yeah, interesting question. I think that it kind of depends on what sort of player you are and how you learn. For me, I like to play all the classes. I feel like I am able to understand other classes more when I get to, be behind the table, looking at the cards, seeing what feels good, what doesn't feel good. And yeah, that's really how I kind of end up learning all the classes in detail. And I feel like my play improves more from playing like that rather than, maining a class. That being said, when you do main a class, you will consistently kind of get better game to game. And you may end up, be playing higher games at a more consistent level rather than, maybe I'm a really good Katsu player, but then I hop on Dorinthia and I don't really know what I'm doing. So the game quality kind of drops a bit. What about you, Hayden?
Yeah, I think I kind of have this rule, I guess, with classes so far in Flesh and Blood is that I feel I want to play a number of games with each class, and that number depends on actually how complicated the class is and how many iterations of the sort of the current decks there are in the class or known sort of information. And I want to do that because I want to understand how the class works and operates. So that's why part of the reason I'm playing Prism right now, right, is that I want to learn as much as I can about that class so that mostly so that I'm prepared to play against it, to be honest. I don't know if it's a class that I would necessarily gravitate towards playing, but I'm a big proponent of playing each of the classes and just understanding the core fundamentals of the class, because I find it really difficult to sit across the table from a hero or a class and really understand what's happening with that class without playing it, because I think there's a lot of nuance to every class in Flesh and Blood. There's a lot of play patterns that aren't necessarily intuitive until you start to play through them and understand it. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of actually playing every class at least to some degree. I find that if I get to like 70% playability on that class, that's probably just a number I'm throwing out there. I don't think it's a given necessarily. But if I said that the top players on those classes play at like 90-95%, if I can get to like 70%, then I'll be happy I understand the class. And then from there, I've probably got a couple of classes that I more want to play, specialize in, learn everything I can about them, and play those to the highest level. But if I've come across, at least the basics of every class, then I feel like I'm more prepared to go into matchups. I feel like I can decide how I want to play those matchups a lot better if I understand how they're going to actually want to play. So I can react and adjust my game plan to what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you talked about Prism there, where you say that you want to play it to, I guess, to understand it to its deepest its deepest complexity, it is important to get your hands on the cards and really get a feeling for what the deck is trying to do exactly. But I think it's interesting you talked about Prism because I tend to gravitate towards classes that make me uncomfortable or that I don't like, right? So I remember before I started playing Kano, I really hated Kano. I hated everything about Kano. Kano is miserable to play against, I think, just categorically. So obviously I didn't like playing against it. Just everything about it made me irritated. And that kind of just flicks something onto my mind where it's like, that's the class I have to play because that's where I'm going to learn the most. That's my biggest knowledge gap. And it's also my biggest weakness at this point as kind of developing as a player. I knew that I would have to know Kano if I was going to be successful in the future because there's going to be a meta eventually where he's going to be dominant and I'm going to have to face him and I'm going to need to know what's going on with that deck. So I agree with you. I think that playing every class is extremely important.
Yeah, I think Dave sums it up nicely with what he says, is it equally important to play other heroes and understand their weak points and play patterns? I think yes is the answer. I think it is important. You don't need to, it comes down to time as well. I think, if you're someone who wants to make the most of their time in this game, then maybe, it's become a class expert and use the time that you do have to maybe do some observation, watch some gameplay of the other heroes or, at your local armories or whatever it might be. Once you finish your game, watch a class that you're interested in being played out by a player that you know or something, or if you've got a friend that plays it, ask them to play a game against you and just discuss and explain their play patterns and what they're doing, and then maybe you can learn that way and it's a bit more time efficient. But I think in general, playing each of the classes is important. I wanted to thank Dave for the question, and if anyone has questions they do want to send in to us to answer on the show, then you can send those to our email. That's arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. Or you can just pop them in the comments section on YouTube and we'll pick those up and we'll be back with another question next week.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And on to the big bad wolf of Flesh and Blood, which is deck building. Deck building is very, very complicated in Flesh and Blood. It was one of the skills that I thought I would never be able to do, had no concept. I mean, I went through so many iterations of putting a pool of cards together, playing it, absolutely not working, and just falling on my face like 100 times. But Hayden is our local expert. He is the brewer. He is the man with all the creativity who brings the decks, and he has taught me everything I know. So, Hayden, I'm going to let you start it off.
I think deck building's interesting. Just to go on your point there, Brendan, I think for me, when I played other games, whether it be Magic or other TCGs, deck building wasn't necessarily something that I inherently loved or did a lot of, mostly because I didn't spend as much time on the game or wasn't, I didn't have the desire, I guess, because a lot of the information was out there, and we've talked about information before and data in this game. But I think with this game, you need to have some semblance of being able to deck build, even if that's to be able to take, current lists or meta decks and tweak them for your expected meta, because there's a bunch of different classes, there's a bunch of different heroes, so I think that's quite important. But if we get into deck building, I think I just kind of want to go straight into the process of deck building. So as I already said, I think deck building is super important. I think if you want to be good at it, you can get good at it. I think if you want to be able to do it, but less fast, you can just start with good core decks that are out there, meta decks, and adapt from there. But I think it's important to know and have at least a process to fixate on, and then you can jump into that process wherever. So I want to talk through my process of deck building and just go through the steps in that. So I do think it's all about having a process. I think the one that gives you clear structure and steps to build within, and then allows you to come back to any of those steps that you go through, and troubleshoot your decks or change plans, adjust cards. You can go and, identify your strengths and your weaknesses and try and, I guess, cater to those and tweak those. So the first part of me for a deck building process is always starts with an idea. So an idea for me when it comes to deck building could be something like a goal or a plan to attack the meta. So I might have this idea about, let's take dash control or dash mid-range in the previous format. I might have had a plan to, I want to be able to beat this deck. I want to attack this deck. Or I want to exploit an interaction between a set of cards, or I want to play with a certain set of cards that have really great synergy together in my eyes. So, maybe I want to build a deck around Sonata Arcanix and Bloodsheath Escalator. Maybe that's my whole idea, and I'm going to go from there. But I think any idea you have has to be robust and really clear. Like, you can't just say, well, I want to play a deck that has 3 Command and Conquer in it. That isn't not really a good starting point. You don't really have a place to start to build around. You don't really have a clear idea of what you want to do with the deck. It doesn't have a game plan. So I tend to, when I'm building ideas, I'll throw a lot of things away in this process. I'll come up with things that are probably just bad or not worth pursuing. But I think everything starts with an idea. So, and one I probably start with more commonly now is to attack a deck, to attack a meta. So if I go back to that mid-range dash example, if I thought about that and wanted to really attack it, then one thing I might hit on is, okay, I think going wide and having on-hit effects is a really good way to punish that deck and attack that deck. So, a Katsu shell could be a really good way to do that. So, because it has access to, cards that go wide and cards that have on-hit effects. So that could be where I start. Once I have my idea, then I'm looking at building out a core plan. And Brendan, as we go through this, I think important if you want to jump in and give your insight. Actually, let me ask that: if you're looking at deck building or things, do you start with an idea as well? Do you generally approach it that way?
Absolutely, that's where everything starts. Everything is with the idea, but that is a subject in and of itself because it's very easy to be like, I want to create the best deck, right? That's where everybody starts, but that's where you can't end up with your ideas. I just want to create the best deck. What I try to do is try to look at a deck, whether we talked about dash control, maybe chain, and say, okay, this is the top deck in the meta right now. This is the deck I want to beat. How do I do that? And then you narrow it down even further. You're like, what is this deck doing that makes it so good? It so good? And how do I beat that? Right? How do I beat that specific card interaction? How do I beat that specific strategy? Whether it's fatigue, it's drone, it's go wide, riftbind, you name it. And I narrow it down to something very, very simple. And then I attack that. And then we build out from there, and we go bigger and bigger and bigger until we find, we get the macro thing, which is something like, okay, Shane's really strong. Well, I need to beat Riftbind, right? So how do I beat that card combo? Snag. Okay. Well, I need to beat aggro. How do I beat that? How do I beat that archetype? Okay. Archetype, I will choose control, right? So now I have snag in a control deck. I want to beat, chain kind of as a hero. So I want a little block on my cards, all this kind of stuff. Okay. I'm looking at Bravo. I'm looking at possibly mech, maybe ninja to utilize flick flack. So you kind of build out from, I think, these very kind of refined or targeted ideas.
Yeah.
Like I talked about the card, and build out further and further and further. And then you'll have a few things to choose from usually. So I end up, kind of at the end of that process, for the examples, I have Bravo, Control Mech, and Control Ninja. They're all essentially doing the same thing. They all have sort of a counter archetype to the archetype that I'm targeting. And they all have a package of cards that beats the card combo that is currently, being oppressive or winning or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's actually, you almost start macro. So you start out here with this whole idea or this thought about, you use the attacking a meta specifically. I think that's one of the most common ways, but it could be, as we said, a set of cards. This broad idea, really broad idea. And then you start to narrow it in, like you said, on-hit effects or ways to counteract one specific thing they're doing in the end game. And you narrow down. And then you work out exactly what it is that you need to target, and then you start to build back out again. Then you come back out. You come from macro to micro, back to micro. Then you start to go, okay, this is what it needs to look like. So, yeah, that's coming up with an idea. The next piece is building out a core plan. So you need to always, in my eyes, start with a really core plan. So you're basically at this point building out a set of cards, which the entire function of the set of cards is to serve one purpose, and that purpose is your core game plan, whether it be to attack one particular deck in a very specific way. So like we just talked about, whether it's to exploit the interaction between two specific cards, so your whole shell is built around that, or it's to, exploit or utilize the interaction or synergies between multiple cards. But if those set cards are the start of your core, then everything else around it is just fuel. There's no noise in there, so if it's resource cards and cards that let you draw it, or if we use like the dash decks, it's Spark of Genius, it's these cards that you get to these cards. There's no noise around there. I'm not just chucking 3 Command and Conquer at this point because the card's good. I'm just focused on the exact core focus and the function of the deck. So don't worry about cute interactions. Don't worry about other matchups other than your focus matchup. Don't worry about matchups at all to start with. Just focus on the cards. You don't even think about sideboarding yet at this stage, or sort of your peripheral options that you could have in the deck. It's just pure resources and cards that do the job. So for me, I'm gonna go back to that ninja example to try and attack mech. For me that was okay. I know I need a number of 0 cost blues as my resources. I need as few non-attack actions as possible. I just want my core combo cards and attack actions. So my leg tap line, I want my head jabs. And then I work out what's to sort of supplement that. So we talked about, cards that just help me do the job. So Ravenous Rabble Red is going to help me do the job because it says go again on it, and it's an attack that's going to help me force Mask Momentum triggers. It's just more cards that function in my core game plan. Strong attack actions, Enlightened Strikes go in there as well because they do the same job. But at the moment, there's nothing else. That's all I'm looking at. So I'm building a core deck to service the function or idea. And now that I've got that core deck, this is exactly where I want to start as a base to execute my plan. And this could be anywhere from 40 to 60 cards. I could already have my entire deck for this matchup sorted right here and now. And I think there's kind of two distinct paths that I go down from here. Now that I've got my core deck. So I think the first one is I have a core of around 40 to 50 cards. And this is probably built around exploiting, interaction or a synergy or a set of cards is generally how this build looks like. So I've got this 40 to 50 card shell that really just does that one job. As we said, it's a mix of the resources and the key cards. If I go back to another example, maybe I'm building a Prism deck and I'm wanting to do as much as I can with with the Lamented Weapon. So almost all the yellow heralds are in there, all the blues. I've got the best heralds I want, and I'm really focused on just that multiple attacks per turn deck. But now I have 48 cards. So what am I going to do with my remaining 12 for my core deck? And this is where I will start to get into building out the rest of my sideboard options or my sort of support package that goes into that main deck depending on the matchup. So that's where I end up then. There's another pathway, which can be, you've already got a 60 card core deck because you've just built a 60 card to beat one specific matchup. So you've already got a streamline 60 and it's just for one particular matchup. And that's kind of that second sort of pathway I go down where I'm not worried yet about that sort of the extra 15 cards or the extra 20 cards, whatever it might be, because I've just got this core 60 to beat a matchup. So it depends on which path you go down, I think, depending on whether you're focused on one particular matchup or you're focused more on sort of the general idea of what the deck's trying to do, regardless of the matchup, if that makes sense, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really like this idea of a core deck, whether that's 50 to 60 cards, whatever you want to be. It's kind of, you've got your sort of cake batter base, and then you got the icing on the cake, which is all the pre-board cards. Your deck has to be functional, right? It has to have an identity, it has to be trying to do something. There are exceptions to this rule where, if we looked at the mech deck back in Crucible, it was sort of a hybrid deck that could either be mid-range or control, and it would side in and out to do both plans. But to explain this in the most clear way, I would think about the Dorinthia deck, right? If you look at Dorinthia, you kind of have this core 50-ish cards where you're just you're doing go again with the weapon. You have pumps, everything basic to try to get counters on your weapon and punish the opponent for blocking incorrectly. After that, you add in cards that are specifically good against certain heroes, whether that's, they're going to be blocking out of hand, so there's a lot of reprise on, or they will be blocking with a lot of defense reactions, so maybe you throw in the Command and Conquerors or, something like that. And then after that, you will get into the pure sideboard cards, the pure niche cards. That could be something as crazy as like, Elrena's Prayer. I forget the name of it because I've played it a few times. But something like that, which is literally just for Kano, literally just for large single sources of arcane damage. That could also be like a Sigil of Solace if an aggro match where you think you're going to die. All these kind of things. Like there are cards that exist that are just purely sideboard cards and are only for very, very specific scenarios.
Yeah. So I wanted to get into, once you've got that core of the deck, what's happening next? Where do you go to from there? So how do you build the rest of that out? So again, those two pathways, going to go down those two pathways. So if you have that core deck that's 40 to 60 cards and is, the Prism example, for instance, is more designed to do one thing than it is to attack a certain deck. So you've got a real sort of cold core there, 40, 50 cards, whatever it might be. Now you're looking to build those support cards out and those sideboard options. And they can do one of three things, I think, those support cards, those sideboard, pre-board, whatever you want to call it, options. The first is they can enhance the core game plan. So, if I use the Prism example again, they could be more yellows, more light cards, different ways to set up that game plan even. So, it could be the fact that I want to have chain is a good example as well. So maybe I have a chain deck and I've got a core of what I want to do, and I could just have more arcane cards to focus on that route of the deck, or I could have more attack actions to focus on that route of the deck. So one way you can start to build out your core is just ways that enhance the deck, and whatever angle of attack that deck takes. You could also change the game plan. That's another thing that your support cards, your pre-board, sideboard, whatever you want to call it, could do. So maybe if I go back to a Prism example, maybe I want to pivot from this, Luminaris build, and I want to go to more of a Aura build. Maybe I want to have Iris in my sideboard as a way to attack more controlling decks, or decks that have those 6 attacks and can break my Phantasm. Well, now I'm thinking about the remainder of my cards being a way to build out that plan. Iris plus Auras plus maybe a couple of extra blues that support that plan. Maybe I want a more defensive package. I think a deck that we built and played in the past was a Rhinar Claws deck, Blood Rush Bellow Art of War deck that was really explosive, but in some matchups like Ninja, that plan wasn't necessarily good enough, so you would change to a Romping Club plan, and you had a bit of a defensive package in there with Sink Belows and Fate Foreseen. So the core of the deck is in its essence, but then there's these packages that can come into either enhance or change your game plan. Or the third option is do a mix of both. So you might have enough cards and enough spots in the deck be flexible enough that you can do both. So some of your slots might be enhancement of the current game plan for certain matchups, and some might be just to swap out your game plan. And this is where actually versatile cards come in handy. So cards that can do a job of being good in either plan. So if you are changing your plan, cards like an Enlightened Strike, that you're happy to play in all matchups, you just get to fill the rest of your core out with these good support cards. I don't like to default to this, because I think this is often a way to make your, core weaker, is just by putting cards in that are just generically good. But sometimes when you want to have the ability to change up game plans, you're not going to be able to have enough cards to do this. You need cards that can kind of do both roles, because you are limited to that 80 card limit. So that's when that can kind of happen. Or if I go back to the Prism sort of example, a card like Soul Shield is always going to be good in Prism because it's a yellow light card, but also in a more controlling plan is a great defensive option. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I would go down. If that's my core of my deck is that 40 to 60 cards that's really focused on executing a really functional game plan. On the flip side of that, if I go back down the other path, if I've got a 60 card deck that's really about attacking a particular matchup, then rather than go and work out what I want to do with the remaining 50 cards right now, I'm going to go and test that core. I've got the 60 cards. Its whole job is to beat a matchup, right? I'm going to go and test the crap out of that matchup. I'm going to find out if the 60 cards I've actually put together does it. If not, I'm going to start to go back to my earlier steps and go and reassess that game plan, reassess the cards in there, reassess what I'm actually trying to do, what aspect of that deck I'm actually trying to attack. Because if that 60 doesn't work into that matchup, I'm probably just going to shelve that plan. It's not worth pursuing. I can go down the road of start thinking about all these sideboard plans and ways I can enhance or change my game plan. But if that core 60 doesn't even do what I need it to do, then there's probably no point. If it does, then I'm going to go. Once I've worked out that 60, then I'm going to flip onto the other path. I'm going to take my 60 card deck that I've worked out in this matchup, and now I'm going to cross over and do a little deviation onto the other path and start to work out, okay, what does the rest of my deck look like? What is the actual essence of this? Now I'm going to work out the true 40 to 50 card core of that deck and work out what I'm bringing in for other matchups or what I'm changing up. So I think there's two really distinct pathways there, Brendan.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too ahead when I'm kind of talking about testing here, but I like what you said, where it's like you have this core. Let's go back to my Shane example, right? Mm-hmm. Like I want to target Shane. So my deck, I don't need to go out and write down a whole entire sideboard plan for every single kind of matchup that I could possibly go into. I know that my deck has to beat Shane or I'm not playing my deck, because I'm building my deck to play Shane and building it to target Shane. So I can come in with my 60 cards that I plan to play in that matchup, test the heck out of it. If it works, then I can start worrying about the other matchups. How targeted do I have to be to Shane? What kind of sideboard pieces can I cut out in order to add in more tools to deal with other heroes? But I think that's super important, is don't get too ahead of yourself sometimes. If you do have something very specific that you're targeting, go ahead, get your 60 that you think are going to work. Go in, play the matchup. If it works, then you keep iterating on it, keep building on it. If it doesn't work, maybe you need to go back and switch some things up.
Yeah, that's why I think that having a process is so important, because if you don't have a process, if I didn't have a process, I would just be throwing cards together, or I would have, maybe a semblance of a plan, but then am I actually testing that plan or, working that plan in a way that's going to be really efficient and beneficial? Like you say, if you're taking a targeted game plan, if I start playing, 10 games of that, but then I go, oh, what does it actually do against other stuff? Work out how it plays into maybe, I don't know, Bravo or Katsu, and then you work out a few things, and then you go, oh, but I need to come back and play that chain matchup again. I've just changed some cards because I was thinking about the cutscene matchup. You come back and you've changed a bunch of stuff. It doesn't work. Then, where are you even at in that process? You're kind of just bouncing around, and you're never going to have a really clear set of, I guess, takeaways, or, you're not going to have these learnings because you're just kind of just trying a bunch of different stuff. And of course, you might have this 60 card deck or this idea and you want to go play it in Armory straight away. And that's fine. You can do that. But, don't mess with your 60 cards or whatever. Just add 15 cards that are going to help you do something in another matchup, and just make sure you keep that together so you can keep testing that matchup in the meantime. I think it's
for
really
sure.
important. Yeah.
I think, to kind of throw out some examples, for me to have a fully fleshed out sideboard on decks I'm working on, it will sometimes take 1 month, 2 months. I mean, it could take, I don't know, all the way up to that month-long process.
Yep.
So that sideboard plan it's something that I focus on, more later. I make sure that my deck is doing what I plan for it to do first, right? I get it as lean and as efficient as possible. And then I slowly add in sideboard cards as I kind of explore other matchups more and see what additional tools this deck will need to survive in a diverse meta.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I would say right now I probably about 70-80% of my decks that I'm looking at don't have, sideboard pre-board options. They're just straight 60 card cores, mostly because they're trying to target specific matchups, or they're trying to do one thing that I'm trying to understand if that one thing is good enough. So I'll actually use Levia as an example. Levia is a class that I'm really interested in. I want to work out if it can do these really core fundamental things at a power level that I think it can. So at the moment, I'm not bothered about, the other 15 cards. I'm just trying to have the best possible 60 I can. And then once I work out what that best possible 60 is, what I'm going to find out from that testing and playing is that there's probably 40 to 50 cards that are the really most important function of that deck. And then that tells me, okay, I've got this 40-50 card core after testing the 60. These other 10 cards are probably more support packages. Maybe they can be changed out for, other cards that can change my game plan, for instance, or they have more flex slots that I can just change depending on what I want to do with this deck overall. So that's kind of how I think is a really good way to learn in your testing process. But yeah, I just come back to that core of the deck is so important. I also have, other decks, for instance, like this Prism build. I started with 75 cards because I was really clear about what I wanted the core of the deck to be and how I wanted to, change it for certain matchups, for example. So that one was a bit different. So I don't think it's always the same, but the fact that I had a process there meant that I knew exactly how I was going to build it. And oftentimes I'll come back to steps in that process. I'll go back to step 2 or step 1 and think about my plan, reassess it. Yeah, I wanted to move on to testing next, Brennan. And testing something that we've spoken a bit on this podcast. We've had a few listener questions about testing and ways to go about good testing. Something that I think we might come back to in the future about really robust testing and what you're trying to find out through this process. But one thing I think that really helps when you get to this part, so you've got your core of your deck, you've got your options, now you're at the testing process, is because you have this really sort of sound theory or set of steps before you get to the testing process. As you start to get into your gameplays, you can actually go back to those prior steps as you start to identify problems. You do a bit of troubleshooting as you go, and because you've gone through all these steps to really flesh out your game plan and have a really good idea of what you're trying to do, the theory behind your deck is going to be a lot more sound, which I actually think helps you in play testing because it saves you quite a bit of time. You can't test everything. Testing does take a while, especially in classic constructed games. Also play out very differently, but if you have that really sound theory behind you, then it's going to make your approaching your gameplay and your testing a lot easier, because rather than play 10, 20, 30 games and finally work out, I should be pitching to set up this end game, if you've already thought about that during your deck building, you can just do that from game 1. You can just be like, okay, this is the way I know I want to try and pitch my deck to set up my end game. And I know you've done that in the past, Brendan. When you approach something, you go, okay, this is the end game I want to set up before you even start to test.
There's some decks that need it definitely more than others as well. But I'm not going to get too far into testing, but if I'm building a new deck, what I do to test other decks against that is a concept called gauntlet decks. So they're just popular meta decks, especially if we're in a season where there's a lot of events going on, which is what Road to Nationals is going to be. If you're going to test decks against the one you're building or trying to, innovate, what I like to do is I will go grab lists that are publicly available, because those are going to be 90% of the lists you're going to run into anyway at a real event. Is that most people are going to net deck, so you might as well net deck when testing against your deck. And also, it makes it so I think that there can be this, you can be a bit incentivized sometimes when you're like, okay, here's this deck we're trying to make work. I'll play the other deck, right? I'll play the Bravo. But then you maybe tweak it a little bit so it's a little bit better against, that new Prism deck or something like that. Yeah, I definitely have seen that happen a few times. So it's easy. Just go on faptcg.com, go to deck list, go net deck something, throw it up, and then you've got your Bravo list, you got your Dorinthia list, and pretty much everything that is in the meta. The list is going to be on the website anyway. And then just go through the list. Like, go through the gauntlet decks, test everything that's popular, start to get, and then after that, elevate to some of the fringe things. And yeah, that's pretty much how we run through the different heroes and the different matchups. So we just straight up net deck the meta, the meta.
Yeah. I wanted to throw one thing. I know we said we weren't going to talk about testing, Brendan, but I have to throw this in because we've talked about it a little bit. When it comes to gauntlet testing, I think it's really important that you have people on the decks who are testing who know the class or know the hero. I think it's no good, and we've said this multiple times, it's no good throwing someone who's never played the class or doesn't know the interactions on the hero onto that deck to test, because you're not going to get the best testing experience. The gameplay is not going to be to the standard you want it to be. So, if you've got a testing group and people are specialists in certain classes or heroes, get them to play those classes in the testing. It's going to be so much more beneficial for your testing. If you don't have people for that, try and play some games against someone. Find someone at locals or someone that through an acquaintance or whatever who plays a certain class, and just get some games in against them, so you can just find out exactly how that matchup plays. It could be very different to how you think it does in your head. So I wanted to go back to just the process and the steps. Once you're testing, you really can go back, go back up those pathways. You can go back to the certain steps you've already gone through, reassess, troubleshoot. Personally, I'm not married to any decks that I make, so I've got multiple decks at this point in testing where I've just set them aside. I've just gone, they're not what I wanted them to do. They don't work quite how I thought. They're not strong enough to attack the deck that I was trying to attack in a certain way. The interaction or set of cards that I've built my whole plan around isn't as good as I thought. It doesn't quite do what I need it to in this current meta. It's not efficient enough, whatever. So I think be prepared to be able to do that. But if you really want to make certain heroes work, you're really dedicated to it, then you just need to go back to that earlier part of the process and just reassess. I did this for 3 months with Azalea, just consistently. Just went back to the start of the process, and this isn't working how I wanted it to work.
And then you ended up at the very beginning.
I think I got somewhere. I think I ended up with a 75 cards that I felt was pretty relevant for that meta. This is, Crucible meta. But yeah, I've definitely gone back up, taken them back to scratch. I have so many projects, just like deck lists, just half strewn, across my desktop. That's like Project 1, Project 65, like just these decks or ideas that I have that don't end up being something. But if they don't work, I'm fine to walk away from them. I don't know about you, Brendan. I know you're pretty passionate.
No. So this is actually one of the most important things, is be okay with failing, because like I talked about in the beginning of this podcast, is when I originally kind of started deck building, I would build up a deck, I would think it was cool, and then it just wouldn't work at all. It was so bad, mostly because of resources and ratios, and I'm just kind of an idiot sometimes. But you have to be okay with like letting that go and not having a big emotional attachment to the deck, which sounds ridiculous. If you haven't deck built before, you're like, why would it be emotionally attached to a deck list? If you put in a lot of time and you're like sitting there before you go to sleep, you think about it, you wake up, you're like, maybe Sleep Dart is good. And then, you have this really good deck, you bring it up to test and it just sucks and it falls on its face. You got to be okay with that. Go back to the drawing board, innovate again, tweak it again. I know for me and for some of my friends that are Canadian named Dante, it can be really rough brewing up something really nice and then having it just get slapped, but that's the game we play.
It's so true. I think we're going to jump into some really important considerations for deck building that are sort of, I guess we're calling them tips to be a successful deck builder. But I'm going to spoil one of them already, Brendan, which is, it's be your harshest critic. No one can be, I guess, harsher on the deck list that you're building than yourself, and be really realistic. You kind of just need to own up to it. You can play a bunch of matchups, test the matchup you're really concerned about, or test this really cool interaction. And if it's not working, you could say, throw up hands and go, I'm getting so unlucky with these draws, or I'm not drawing the right cards at the right time. But the thing to do really is to take a step back and go, okay, there's a reason for that. I don't have the right resource base. I don't have this interaction isn't as powerful as I thought it would be. These cards, they're not as consistent as I need them to be when I draw them. There's always going to be reasons that you can reflect on. Yeah, you might hit a patch of variance 1 or 2 games, but you can pretty quickly see if the idea you have is actually a good one or not. And I know with you, Brendan, seen me go through the roller coaster of emotions. Hey Brendan, I've got this deck I think can attack this in a certain way. Let's play a couple of games, and then I win the first game or something, and then now Brendan knows my game plan, and then the next 5 games I just lose and go, well, I felt good for 10 minutes, but okay, I'm done with this now.
To be fair, Hayden is probably the most reasonable person I have ever played against when it comes to this scenario, because there's 2 other people. I'm going to talk about both of them. There was Sasha Markovic, who played 100 games of Azalea Blitz against me, and I think lost 90 of them. 90 plus, ridiculous. So he's he just wouldn't give it up. And then there's Dante Delfico, who I beat. He brews up a nice Prism deck, and I beat him, and he doesn't talk to me for a week.
I'm going to start a counter of names in this podcast. So which names get mentioned the most? And Dante, you're winning, just so he knows. Yeah, I think it's important to just be able to be honest. And at the end of the day, right, if you're deck building in Flesh and Blood, there's a couple of reasons for it. The first reason, which we'll just get out of the way, is you just really like the hero and you just want to build a really awesome fun deck that you can take to locals. At that point, you don't have to be as harsh on yourself. You just want to build the best you can be. And yeah, you want to tweak it and get it right. The next is that you want to build, as Brendan said, you want to get to that grail. You want the best deck in the format. And if you are trying to get to that, you're trying to get to the best deck or a deck that's going to win you an event, then you need to be really harsh on what you're putting together. There's no 2 ways about it. You've got to do it. Because you're just going to end up wasting time on probably ideas or things that aren't necessarily going to get you there, I think.
100%.
All right, Brendan. So let's get into these considerations for deck building. The first sort of consideration or tip, I guess, is that I will always write out my sideboard plan and ensure that my core of my deck is being fully utilized, as it should be, and that all the support and sideboard cards are doing their job and not actually just deck cards for no reason. So by writing out my sideboard plan, for each matchup, I'm going to work out, am I just bringing in this 1 card for 1 matchup? Is my change of game plan that I've gone through in my steps actually changing my game plan how I want it to be? This is kind of what the step, or I guess this tip, this piece of information lets me do. I know, Brendan, you're a big proponent of this as well, is write out that plan, have that plan really core.
Well, the main reason I like this, because I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of an idiot. So, I remember when I used to build, I built a Dorinthia deck a while ago. I think it was before Monarch. It was a constructed deck. And I had all these sideboard cards that I had added, and I ended up writing up the sideboard, the sideboard on paper, right? What am I going to put into this matchup? When I put in that matchup, then I realized there were some cards in my deck which I didn't even use at all.
Exactly.
So it's important. It's do you really need that card? And you'll find out pretty quickly if you go ahead and write it down and figure out, what exactly you are taking out, what exactly you are bringing in for each matchup.
Yeah, I think I've done this so many times where I go, this card is, something that I want to add to flex my game plan or enhance my game plan for the specific matchup. And then I go through and go, okay. And then I'm bringing it in here and I'm taking out, wait, what am I taking out? There's no, I'm already I've got a 50 card core. I've got 10 cards that are already coming in this matchup. And now I'm trying to add this 11th and 12th card. And they're just not needed, or they're just, I can't find a space for them. Happens, I think, quite often. So yeah, I'm always really clear about what's coming in every matchup and what my sort of peripheral, sideboard pre-board is doing around my core of my deck. Next tip, it's so important to know that a core is a core. When we talk about this 40 to 50-ish cards, that solid core is to execute a plan. I just want to go over it again. It's a core. I never take these cards out, or basically ever. There's a couple of times where I might have resource cards that I might swap out, but that's so niche, or for a matchup that's 1 in 100. But in general, the core is the core. I'm never changing it. Once I'm settled on that 40, I might change cards in that core in my deck building process. I might find the cards aren't doing what I quite need to in the core, but in terms of the sideboarding plan, I'm not changing them. And the reason for that is that core is so functional in the way I've built it. It's got the right ratios of the resources. It's got the right amount of cards that are going to draw me into the things I need. And then everything else that comes into it is really either change the game plan, supplement the game plan, or do a mix of both.
100%.
And then again, if I start with that 60 cards instead of that core 40 to 50, then I think I already said this, but I'll go back down that path and work out what the actual core of that 60 is for every matchup and go from there again, do that process. Thirdly, synergies are so important. I actually can't understate how important synergies are in this game in Constructed Flesh and Blood. You'll find that certain cards might be great options on paper, but then when you play or do a bit more robust sort of theory about them, they just don't work in your core plan. So I think a great example of this, if I go back to the Ninja deck that I was talking about earlier for the Crucible meta, I really wanted to utilize Art of War because I wanted to go wide and present on-hit effects. And so putting more non-attacks into my deck, into my core, like say a Razor Reflex, which for instance I thought would be a great card in that deck, just didn't work. There's just too many non-attack actions. It just actually took away from the synergy of my overall deck. I needed more attack actions and I needed cards that worked really well with my attack actions, and the threat of drawing a hand that had all non-attack actions or 2 non-attack actions was just too high and too costly to the core of my deck that I couldn't play certain cards. So yeah, there's cards that's going to detract from other cards. Another example, of this is I'm building out a Rhinar deck. I'm talking about 6 attack matters in my deck. So I'm thinking about what's the threshold I need to get to? And if I start taking away 6 attacks to put in other cards that I think are going to be just really great solid cards, I want to get like, Tome of Fiend down there. I want to put E-Strike in. Yeah, exactly. You're going to start to take away from the core of your deck and actually weaken your deck, which is not where you want to be.
Yeah, the biggest trap in Fab deck building is throwing in all the generics that feel good. Because what you're going for is synergy in a lot of your decks. As the card pool expands, we will move farther and farther away from generics. Gone are the days where every single deck runs a copy of Sink Below and Sigil Solace. But we still see it to an extent with cards like Enlightened Strike, Command and Conquer, Razor Reflex. These are still very, very popular. You see them played in a lot of decks where they shouldn't be. E-Strike is a bit different because it is so modal. It can be used in so many different situations. But I've seen Command and Conquer in so many decks where it doesn't belong. It is ridiculous. We have transitioned away from a defense reaction format, so Command and Conquer's efficacy as well has gone significantly down. But it is a serious consideration with a limited card pool. I know I said that was expanded, but it is still limited. Mm-hmm. Is that you have a deck. It's like, what are the most powerful cards in the game? Okay, how do they fit in my deck? You can do that. And sometimes it will be successful. I know that like the Shane deck that we played at the PTI, I didn't play, but helped build. Yeah. Like we did that. We had a Shane deck where it was very, very, I guess like role play, right? Like it had a lot of Shane cards, it had a lot of Runeblade cards, it had a very clear identity. And then it turns out you just throw in Command and Conquer, E-Strike, and all this other crap, and it was kind of better because it could do damage on turn 0 and turn 1 rather than just turn 4, turn 5. Yeah. So sometimes it's effective. But that being said, I think that it's a big trap.
Yeah, those cards had a reason to be in the deck. I think that's what it comes back down to is, so those cards in the deck hurt the overall synergy, I'd say, pretty minimally, but you got a lot from them, which was that you plugged a weakness, and the weakness of that deck was that turns 1 to 3 were generally very weak for you without those. So you had these cards that came in to fill out the core of your deck, that were supplementing your game plan. So that's just a really core example of using that process to work out what cards should be in there. And a good example, if we talk about Command and Conquer, maybe Dorinthia, just throwing it in there, not the right spot for it. But if we look at Rhinar, it has great synergy with being a 6 attack and also has a really strong effect that's going to help you. So that's a lot more synergistic in that deck, for instance. So these strong generics can be synergistic in your decks. Just because they're generic doesn't mean they can't be. But it's about just taking a step back and actually understanding what they do, what their role is, and if they're actually doing more harm, they are good. Because as you said, as more sets have come out, the card pool's grown, synergy has become so much more important. In Welcome to Wraith and even Arcane Rising, it was so much more about just good, solid decks, utilizing the best cards, and having a really strong game plan. Now it's about setting up turns, setting up game states as we move along in this game. Cool. Wanted to jump into, I guess this is number 4. And this is a little bit, I guess, I'm trying to think of the word here, but it's basically sometimes you're going to have a weak matchup, and that's okay, and that's something just to keep in mind. It's, I guess, a little bit philosophical, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Sometimes you're going to have bad days, but most of the time you're trying to have a good day. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some, I think there are going to be classes that you're going to struggle against. Like if we don't have to look at the current meta, like Dorinthia does struggle with Prism. You can slightly tweak that to kind of go for a go wide Dorinthia, but Prism is always going to be a harder matchup. Does that mean if I play Dorinthia, I devote 20 cards of my deck to targeting Prism? Maybe. If it's literally the only thing I'm worried about, yeah, maybe. I know that some of the iterations of Shane have had 10 plus cards of his deck be devoted to beating a singular matchup. But sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days, right, Hayden?
Yeah, it's a part of deck building where you can go over every matchup and realize, okay, like you say, I just won't have the cards for this matchup, and I just don't have room for them. So
it's like not putting Null Rune in your deck, right? Like you don't put Null Rune in your deck. How does your Kano match up? It's probably dog water, but still, you don't expect a lot of Kanos, so it's okay.
Exactly. So there's two options, right? You can live with it. Think, okay, that matchup, I might play it once in a 10-round event, and if I play it, I'm the underdog and I just have to play tight, and I have a plan for it, but I don't have the cards that I might want to have in there to supplement my plan or change my plan in order to help me in this matchup. And that's okay if you think it's right and it's a meta call, that's fine. Or the other option is that if the matchup's really important, you need to go back and change your configuration, change up certain cards to be able to give you a better matchup. But there's some really important considerations if you're going to do that, and that's to think, do the new cards that I'm putting in actually counteract my core plan? Am I cutting cards from my core plan to be able to do this? Am I starting to shave like a resource card here or a card here that comes in to supplement my game plan? Am I hurting my synergies? That's really important to think of, because if you are, it might not be worth even doing this. Do the cards these cards that are being taken out, so the spots that are being filled, are they vital to other matchups? So now you're weakening other matchups just to help one particular matchup. And could you, I guess the third piece of this is, could you compromise and play sort of a great all-rounder that could, hurt you a little bit in other matchups, but you gain a lot more from it than what you're losing. I guess a good example in the Ninja deck is that against Warrior, the 2 defense cards really count. They really hurt you. So my thought was, okay, well, is there a way to put in defensive cards for that matchup? No, because it takes away from your core game plan. If you draw a hand of multiple defense reactions after you've just put them on the back foot, you can't keep your pressure up. It's just not where you want to be. You can't jam flick flex in there and hope that you draw them on the right turn, because if you draw them on the wrong turn, you draw them with an Art of War, they're going to be so bad for you. Okay, well, can I maybe have more 3 defensive cards that can replace 2 defensive cards in the core of the deck? Well, there's not really the right options for that. So, okay, my game plan is to race them, and it's not the optimal game plan, but it's one that doesn't hurt my other game plans. I'm not changing cards to the extent that I'm just ruining my core of my deck or ruining other matchups. So I still have a plan there. It's just not quite the optimal plan.
I've seen so many bad deck lists that have tried to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably one of the biggest traps. Like you see a lot of aggro decks that are also control decks that are also mid-range decks. That are also combo decks, and it ends up being none of those, because that's what it comes out. It's just a pile of cards. So it is important. I mean, we did talk about this a lot, but focusing on your deck score competency. What are you trying to do? But don't let that limit you too much, because there have been a lot of successful decks in the past that have been very kind of dynamic and modular. One of the most famous ones being the mech deck, which was both a mid-range deck and a control deck. And Hayden also mentioned Rhinar as well, which transitioned to sort of a control-y, fatigue-y game plan, from what I understand when Kieran played it, but was also had its general mid-range plan as well. So it's possible, but be careful, because if you try to beat everything and do everything, you can just end up with a straight pile of cards at the end of the day.
Everything, yeah. You just end up being like just 40% against everything. And that's the trap with mid-range, right? Like mid-range is really difficult to get right. It's actually way easier to just have one singular game plan and make your deck really, really good at it, because that's easier to do. Something like that mech deck was so strong because it had been so tuned to be able to do both these things and be able to do them well, and that's not easy to do. You can't, it's really hard to have 2 almost game plans in opposition, because your card pool is going to be 70-80% the same in each of those games. So it's you can't take out and change your whole deck. We already spoke about the be your harshest critic. It's so important, how these cards go together and work together. Going back to the drawing board, thinking about non-synergistics, thinking about certain plans for certain matchups. If they don't work, being honest about it and going back to the drawing board on that. The next thing, or I guess actually this might be the last one we'll talk about, is ratio. So I know this is something that people ask a lot of questions about. People want to know how many blues, yellows, reds should they play in any given deck. And the answer is it depends. It really does depend. I think if you want a really good resource for understanding resource ratios in your deck, go and check out Jason Long's article on Channel Fiber. We'll put the link in the description. Jason's been a big proponent of understanding ratios in decks and numbers of blues to make sure that you draw one in each hand or that you don't brick on certain turns. And he's put up a really good article. I think this article is now a few, maybe start of the year, end of last year, but it's timeless. I think in terms of what it talks about in this game, it will be timeless because every card is your resource. So go check it out. But if we want a few, sort of, I guess, simple rules of thumb, there's a few ways you can think about this, and it's really the best thing to do is think about what do you want to draw on any given turn to be able to play the cards and execute your game plan. I think that's the best way to think about it. I'll throw a few examples and then Brendan jump in if you want. If I think about Ninja, so let's talk about Katsu. Okay, I'm playing a Katsu aggro deck. I want a 0 cost blue in almost every hand, but I'm okay with having a yellow in some hands. That would help me still help me function and execute my game plan. Okay, well, I'm looking at 12 to 15 blues then, roughly, plus some yellows that are 0 costs. I'm playing Brute. I want to have yellow in every hand, and I want to have a 6 attack in every hand. Okay, well, yellow 6 attacks are going to be my best friend, and I probably want, at least a third of my deck almost to be those. Work from there. Guardian. I want 2 blues in every hand, and I'm okay with 3, but I never want less than 2. So I'm looking at 35 to 40 blues. So just being realistic and knowing that if you start cutting resources to try and fit other cards in or bring in your sideboard cards or whatever it might be, you're probably doing a massive disservice to your deck, and it's probably going to be massively detrimental. Resources are so important. The balance of the deck is actually just one of the most important things in this game.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty comprehensive. I would say, speaking from my experience, I'm kind of I'm the deck building type that would just yellow cut the blues for more damage and then just feel the pain later.
I know
definitely don't do that. I know we'll be testing sometimes. And Hayden be like, "How many blues are you running?" He's running like 24. I'll be like, 17. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the math and the ratios are probably one of the most important things in deck building, and it's going to be your easiest shortcut once you do get it down. So I do recommend, kind of heeding Hayden's advice, and then also checking out that article by Jason Long.
It's so good. Yeah, Jason has always thought about this since the game came out, and I've learned so much from the way that he thinks about it. I think a good way to think about this we just talked about, your 17 blues versus my 24, is sometimes you might draw multiple blues in a hand, right? And you go, oh, this is so bad for me. I need less blues. You also need to work out how big of an impact that is versus not drawing any resources in your hand. So if your deck can function well off low resources, then you have this case to be like, okay, I can actually get away with playing less resources, not because I can just get away with it, but because actually drawing a handful of multiple resources is not good for me. My blue cards aren't very functional, and that's something I like to talk about, is how functional your resources. So if I take the chain deck, for example, that we featured in the deck tech, a lot of those blues are really functional. So if you draw multiple of them, you're happy, you're actually okay. So like Movrin Skies, for instance, is a really functional card as a blue, but also as an action card to trigger your Nebula Blade and give you go again. Whereas if I think about with the Katsu deck, for instance, the aggro Katsu deck, then a lot of the blues I had in that deck were not very functional. Lord of Wind by itself is not very good. Blue Plunderer was probably the most functional, and even that's like only okay. Actually, I had Energy Potion as well. Okay, so like half the blues were functional, but the other half were pretty bad. Blue Whelming Gust Wave isn't very exciting. So yeah, think about your ratios, but also what those cards do, what your resources do. I think about them like in Warrior, for instance, where Blue Warrior's Valor, that's okay, but like Blue Iron Song Response or Blue Stroke of Foresight, am I excited about those cards? Probably not.
Yeah, Blue Stroke, no. Blue Iron Song Response, I love that card.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah, all right, Brent. I think that kind of wraps it up. I did just want to recap quickly the process, because obviously this is an audio medium, not a visual medium. I'll always start with an idea. That's how I start my process. I start with an idea, and I build out to a core plan from there. That's my core deck. Then I'm looking at my peripherals, my sideboard, my pre-board options. Then I'm going in and testing. And then I'm going back to any number of those steps in the process and reassessing. And then in each step of that process, there's a lot happening, whether it be within my idea to start with, where I'm actually like diving in deep to understand how to attack a certain game plan, and then I'm coming back out to work out what that means for me. Or I'm building out my 40, 50 card core and then tweaking that, or I'm building out my 60 card for a certain matchup and just testing it. There's so many things that are happening in the process. And I think, I just want to say the best way to deck build, I think, is to have a process. Process, Brendan.
It's like your favorite word.
I'm just trying to see how many times I can get it into the episode.
Anyway, I guess that's my cue to go ahead and do my thing and why they pay me the big bucks. So if you have enjoyed, this podcast or any of the podcasts we've done before, we do have a YouTube channel that is Arsenal Pass, Arsenal Space Pass on YouTube. We do additional deck techs and gameplay on there. So go check it out. And we are kind of climbing up subscribers very fast, and it's been really awesome to see the support. Almost at 700, coming up on 1,000. We'll do something fun for that. So if you want to throw us a subscription, we would always appreciate it. Me and Hayden are also now on Twitter. We have figured out how to use the social media thing, us boomers, and Hayden is at Fiendel, so that's like Toma Fiendel, so at FYEN_DALE, his last name, and I am at the Fitty Shades, THE Fitty Shades, which is my online alias. You can see me in the Discord. But yeah, got a couple more videos coming up on YouTube this week, so I think that will be some classic constructed gameplay. So definitely click that subscribe button, throw on the notifications, and you'll be alerted when we toss up the video. But with that, that's all for this week, and we will see you next week.
See you later.